Welcome to This Just In, the show bringing you the latest advancements in healthcare, strategy, innovation, and public policy. And now, for the fastest voice in healthcare, here's your host, Justin Barnes.
Thank you for tuning in, and welcome to This Just In. I'm your host, Justin Barnes. In these segments, I'll bring you the latest advancements in healthcare, strategy, innovation, and public policy. As always, we're broadcasting from the This Just In studios on the Business Radio X network, as well as the Healthcare Now radio network. For this episode, my 209th episode, we have a very special guest returning to the show, Alex Lennox-Miller, Senior Analyst from Chilmark Research. Welcome back to the show, Alex.
Thank you so much, Justin. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, in my 5 years of broadcasting, you were the very first guest that I've ever invited for back-to-back shows, and we had such a great conversation. I just wanted to keep it going, and so thank you for that, my friend.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, if you've never read Alex's research or Chilmark's research in general, it's tremendously informative, and their strategy is just spot on to where and how healthcare is evolving. So I certainly look forward to this show. And as I mentioned last year when we recorded for the first time, I've been actually reading your research for, well over a decade now, and tracking what Chilmark does. So great insights for the industry. Thank you for that. So tell us a little bit about your most recent research. I know we'll dive into the show, and I have a series of questions for you. But at a high level, tell us what you're thinking, what your research is pointing towards right now.
Sure. Well, what we've seen in the past 6 months of the COVID pandemic has been this, at first, explosion of the use of telehealth and slowly starting to sort of recede a little bit. Mm-hmm. But as you know from what we talked about last time I was on the show, I've never been convinced that telehealth is the sort of clinical cure-all that it's often treated as. I'm much more interested in the use of other technologies that have a lot more potential to really relieve provider burden, provider stress, staff burden, and make a much bigger clinical impact. And one of the interesting things that's been a little bit under-addressed in the media and the analyst community has been that along with the explosion of telehealth, we've also seen a real expansion of those technologies in monitoring and care at home and hospital at home technologies. And so this report really focuses on how we're seeing that care model evolve into something that we're calling distributed healthcare, something that recognizes the importance of access, the importance of the provider relationship and the in-person office visit, but also leverages technology in much more creative, innovative, and functional ways that kind of gets away from the focus of the encounter or the appointment, takes care out of the office, but doesn't necessarily make it all virtual. And so that's really what the report focuses on. We're looking at different aspects of it, how different technologies and different vendors are approaching it, how different markets are approaching it, and really trying to get at the root of what enables it, what's needed to really turn it into the most effective system it can possibly be, and where we see that going over the next, say, 3 to 5 years.
Wow, that's phenomenal. That's spot on to where I spend most of my time in the industry. I'm deeply in virtual care and telehealth and remote patient monitoring, and I call it remote care monitoring and remote care management, I should say, actually, remote care management. And actually the entire digital journey for the patient. So, and you talk about distributed healthcare, and I love it. So spot on to what I'm seeing, and I certainly look forward to seeing some of the research. So how do you plan on, when do you think some of this initial research will be ready, and when you start to roll it out to the industry and share it with the industry? How will that work?
Well, the initial research is actually getting rolled out later this week. We're doing this one a little bit differently because we feel like this is really information that needs to get out there. Mm-hmm. We want to really present it much more rapidly. Our usual reports, the research, the vendor interviews, the primary and secondary research are really deep and really time consuming. But we wanted to get this out as quickly as possible. So we're doing this one a little bit differently. This is getting monthly releases to our subscribers of a research note. something that picks a specific area and really focuses in, dives deep, whether it's, what the different technologies involved in this are, who the different vendors are, what the markets and our impact and the impacts we see there are. And then we're rolling all of that up into a report that will be publicly available in December.
Excellent. So diving into some of your recent findings and certainly some of your thoughts here, what are the big takeaways from the boom? And then a little bit of the, I guess some people call it a slow decline, but of telehealth, but really what's behind the big takeaways of the boom? And then what are some important lessons there for us?
Honestly, the most impressive thing about it to me, and I think the biggest takeaway that I think people should get from it, is that when push comes to shove, organizations and practices and systems of all sizes really can deploy technology quickly and at scale. For so long, we've been used to the sort of institutional inertia of healthcare, and it's become a piece of conventional wisdom that healthcare just doesn't change quickly. And the fact of the matter is that clearly, when it needs to, it can. And patients can learn it quickly, providers can learn it quickly, systems can deploy it quickly. It doesn't have to be this sort of two-tiered healthcare system that we're used to, where some organizations are really well-developed or really agile, and others are just, essentially doing things the same way they were doing them 10 or 20 years ago. To me, that's the single biggest takeaway.
Excellent.
The other thing that we're learning, clearly, telehealth appointments are clinically feasible. There's been a lot of questions about that over the years. Can the standard of care be maintained? It can. But it doesn't fix all the problems. Yeah. When you look at what providers are reporting, when you look at surveys of patients, the issues that people have been having with the healthcare system for years are still there in terms of provider stress, provider burnout, patient access, patients not feeling heard. Telehealth hasn't solved those, and there was no particular reason to think it would, except that that's what we were told would happen. So the problems fundamentally in the system aren't solved by having the same kind of appointment that's done in a different way. Now, obviously, in the current circumstances, we needed to do it. Nobody had a choice, and a telehealth appointment or a phone appointment is absolutely better than nothing.
Yes.
But at the same time, we've really had a crash course in what telehealth and what virtual or remote appointments do well and what they don't do well. The other big, I think, lesson or the really big takeaway for me is that as we've looked at practice closings, we're learning that the fee-for-service system is not nearly as stable as I think most people thought it was. For years, we've looked at signing on to an ACO or taking capitated contracts or value-based care contracts and called it taking on risk. Mm-hmm. And it turns out most of the risk there is on the fee-for-service contract.
I would agree.
Because as soon as that volume declines, those are the practices that are closing.
Yep. That's a very, very good point. Actually, I want to address a couple of things because you mentioned this in your opening comments around provider burnout. And I've seen, I completely agree that telehealth is not a panacea for it. And it actually can increase it if you don't have, and this is where really, I think you're going to probably find this in your research if you haven't already, is disjointed solutions, the ones that really aren't integrated with telehealth or they're just trying to layer it on. That's adding on to all provider stress. And this is where, really having a universally integrated, entire platform for your virtual care can really help, because trying to make providers bounce between one system and another system and then multiple different screens and it's very difficult. It's also difficult for patients to navigate these different appointment types and visit types and products and applications and apps and stuff like that. And so it's one of the areas where I spent a lot of time, but one of the areas that I've had a lot of fun with, and this might come out in some of your best practices, is around managing how to really shift your schedule as a provider. So as we kind of come back after this, the closing of the office system, it's like, all right, hey, you can be open on every day, but certain hours, or we say, you know what, you're gonna do in-office appointments for how to reschedule your appointment and shift them, but either do these set of appointments from Monday from 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And then on Tuesday mornings between 8 a.m. and 11:30 a.m., you're going to do telehealth appointments. And you can slot them every 15 minutes, every 10 minutes, every 20 minutes, whatever, it depends on specialty and the practice and the provider proficiency, but really optimizing that schedule. And I found having a lot of fun with that. Have you come across that at all with helping them?
No, absolutely. And,
Okay.
the other major component of that I see really happening and that I'm really hopeful for and makes me really excited is organizations and systems really starting to examine the idea of what needs to be an appointment and what doesn't.
That's right.
What needs to be in person and what doesn't. Not everything needs to be an in-office, check-in.
Yeah.
Not everything needs a manual phone call. Maybe there are a lot of appointments or a lot of touch points or a lot of communications or encounters that can be automated or can be done remotely or through an app or a piece of software. You don't want to do everything that way. But I'm really excited that we're starting to see practices really re-examine that
Yes.
and prioritize things and say, this one is essential. It needs to be in person. I need to be able to see the person. I need to be able to really, dig in deep. But this one doesn't. This one can be a phone call. And this one, if we have a piece of software that they can just check in, that's all that needs to be.
Right.
When we look at the appointments that take up most volume in a provider's time, it's chronic and polychronic patients who are doing check-ins. And a lot of that does not necessarily need to be an appointment. It needs to happen.
Yeah.
We need to have that information. But if we can prioritize that, if we can redirect some of that time and give providers some of that time back, that's an enormous improvement.
Yes.
Both in their time and for the patient.
That's fantastic. Spot on. So how do we sustain the growth of virtual care going forward? And I guess, and should we, but how do we do it if we do?
I think we absolutely should.
Yep.
I think at this point, the genie's out of the bottle, whatever metaphor you want to use. The cat's out of the bag.
Why would they put a cat in a bag? That was
I've never understood that.
I know.
It's never been a question I wanted to explore too
Exactly.
deeply.
You got it.
Patients have been clamoring for this stuff for years. When you look at what patients want most, what they're most interested in. So this stuff is not going away. And in the absence of it, what we've seen has been patients moving towards systems or applications that give them some version of care that's easier to access, that's more on demand, that's cheaper. Whether it's a retail clinic, whether it's urgent care, whether it's going to an emergency room, using, Dr. Google, right?
Yeah.
Patients do these things because they can't get the care they actually want in the way that they need it. So patients aren't giving this up. But what we can do is really leverage the breadth of virtual tools to give patients the access to the full suite of potential solutions that they need and that they want access to, and that make providers' lives and really improve the situation for systems and organizations. So telehealth is absolutely a part of that. But you also have, for example, asynchronous or AI-driven telehealth, triage systems, symptom checkers that can take a lot of that staff burden away from having to answer the phone, track down a provider, get an answer, call the person back, get the next set of questions, track the provider down again, that are a lot easier to use on the weekend or after hours. If I have a sore throat on Saturday, I don't want to wait until Monday to see my doctor. And if I can get a response sooner than that, that's really all I need. Like you mentioned, it includes remote patient monitoring, home monitoring, remote care management. It includes patient engagement, whether that is outreach to the patient, whether it's information coming from the patient in the form of PROs, patient-reported outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
We're starting to see some really great deployments in remote behavioral health.
Yes.
Not just telepsychiatry, but CBT and DBT training happening through an app. Awareness training, mindfulness exercises, things that are really helpful and valuable to people, but that they don't necessarily need a direct appointment to do if they have other ways to access it. And those are things that offer really incredible clinical value. If you talk to any provider, and I'm sure you know this, behavioral health plays an incredibly important role in the management of chronic disease.
Yes.
If you can't maintain somebody's mental and emotional stability, they're never going to be able to manage those other things.
Yep, I completely agree.
You know, the other side of it, and I think this is really the biggest challenge, is that, as you said, we need to really start moving away from having just a huge swath of different solutions. Mm-hmm. This fragmented system as it currently exists is a huge challenge. And it's a challenge to patients, it's a challenge to providers, it's a challenge to systems, it's a challenge to vendors.
Yes.
You know, the question of, you know, what you need to integrate with, what systems do you need to play nicely with, that's not a fun question to have to answer for anybody.
Right.
So that, I think, is the single biggest challenge that needs to be tackled in order to really sustain this momentum.
So let's dive into that. I think that's the kind of that leads into my next question. What is the biggest driver of, you know, provider purchasing in virtual tools? And I know we just talked about some of the important components of it, but what are some of the biggest drivers?
You know, the most interesting one right now, and the one that I was surprised to hear, because I expected to hear, well, you know, patients are demanding it. I expected to hear, well, you know, we're just desperately trying to maintain our volume. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of money out there right now.
Right.
Whether it's from the CARES Act, whether it's some of the FCC subsidies, state grants, and that's driving a lot of purchasing. I've heard multiple people compare it to a sort of mini high-tech act.
Yes.
Where providers are really just taking advantage of the fact that now they don't have to fund this themselves. They don't have to fund it on spec, essentially, and they can build out their toolkit in ways that they kind of couldn't afford to before. The risk of that, obviously, is something similar to what we saw with the High Tech Act, where you have people who are being a little bit, I don't want to say unscrupulous, but not careful. You don't want people to buy stuff just because the money is there and they can. You want them to be thoughtful about it. You want them to have planning and really understand their needs. But we're really in a fantastic convergence of the need for these systems, the understanding of the value of these systems, and the ability to, you know, have some help in purchasing and deploying them.
Yeah, I completely agree. This has been a mini high tech act from a standpoint of the money flowing certainly into the FQHCs and other markets like that are, you know, safety nets for the RHCs and the CHCs, the safety nets of our communities and infrastructure and the fabric of a lot of our societies and communities. And so, and I've engaged a lot of the FQHCs nationally. It's exciting to see them adopt technology. It's exciting to see their patients, you know, adopt technology and really see and receive the care they deserve. So that's been a nice byproduct of this past 4 to 6 months. So how is patient access to virtual tools changing, and what does that mean for the healthcare stakeholders?
The patients are getting care or accessing care, I guess, as you put it, basically from three different directions. From my point of view, they're getting it from their provider, whether that's through a patient portal or through prescribed apps or just what their provider uses in one particular way. They are getting it themselves as a consumer. But really the biggest one is that more than ever, patients are accessing it through their employer or through their insurer. A self-insured employer obviously has a big stake in this. And when you look at some of the big IPOs that have happened this year, and some of the big merger and partnership announcements that have come out, solutions like Livongo are really heavily in that employer market. That's what drives their bottom line. That's who's using them. Is companies that are trying to, first of all, provide it as an incentive or as a benefit to their employees, but are also trying to drive down their own costs, trying to drive down that overall benefit spending. If you're self-insured, if you have high costs for your employees, that can be really valuable. The risk there, and I don't want to beat the drum too much, but we keep coming back to it for a reason, is that then you have much more fragmented care.
Yes.
You've got people who are acting on healthcare, trying to resolve problems without having that unified communication, without having everybody in the same loop. And it's better for somebody to be trying to address their diabetes than not addressing it. But ideally, you want everybody on the same page.
Yes.
And the more that space is sort of seeded, or that information doesn't get relayed, or that loop doesn't get closed, the worse it is for everybody.
I agree. Let's I got one last question here before we have about a minute and a half left for our interview. But let's talk about the new level of virtual care and what it means for the major healthcare vendors like EHRs, and maybe some of the new entrants coming in.
Well, this is I think where the kind of solution to that is trying to appear. For a long time, EHRs have been a little stagnant. They've been really slow to respond. They're expensive. They're not necessarily great at integrating all of the solutions and all of the tools that somebody might want to use, especially when you're trying to bring in stuff from outside, like an employer solution or something like that. Now you've got EHRs that are trying to improve there, but they're doing it slowly, and you have competitors coming in from outside who are really threatening them. And this is a really, I think, new development in the healthcare IT space. EHRs have been the big dog, the central pillar of healthcare IT for decades, and that position is now being threatened. Whether it's in partnership with some organizations like AWS is doing, whether it's trying to do it on its own, the way Microsoft is doing. The Microsoft Cloud for Healthcare announcement really kind of fell under the radar when it came out back in May. But the solutions and the tech that they announced, the Azure compatibility with IoT, that's a huge threat to the role of the EHR as anything other than a purely clinical database. Whoever is the organizer of all of these disparate data streams, whoever is the one who aggregates them, who rolls them together, who analyzes them, who provides care management workflows, clinical recommendations, engagement, and outreach, that's going to be that central solution, the new central solution for healthcare. And it may not be the EHRs. And the way that they respond to that is really going to determine whether or not they're able to retain that central focus. And clearly, there are some really big companies out there that think that they won't.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. And that's where I spend a majority of my time. I spend a lot of time in virtual care and innovation there, but I also see, those platforms as they're the centralized data source now, or they're quickly becoming the centralized data source. And it's an exciting place to be. I completely agree with you that it's, and hopefully with the Cures Act, we can create interoperability and we have the data flowing. I also completely agree with you on your other point where we've got to have these data streams flowing for the patient. The providers have got to have access to the data. The patient certainly has to have access to that data. We have to have this data integrated so we have a full longitudinal patient record no matter where we are. And the Cures Act really does move us closer to that. I've seen how it breaks down. It's broken a lot of walls on the interoperability front and many more to come. We're still in the very early days. But I've seen it just in my world on how data is starting to flow better. It's getting cheaper for interoperability, which is great because a lot of those artificial barriers were put up. So no, it's great to see. I am at time. So Alex, as always, you are a phenomenal guest of the show. We will certainly have you back. I always love our conversations, and your research is just spot on. So thank you.
Well, I always have a great time. This is always a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you having me back.
You got it. And we'll certainly do it again. The time goes very, very quickly. But thanks again to you and everybody for joining us today. And please tune in weekdays at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, 11:30 a.m. Pacific to hear our shows. You can always track me on Twitter at HIT Advisor and use the hashtag ThisJustinRadio so we can respond to your comments from the show. If you miss any of this episode or want to hear more, all my shows are posted on Apple iTunes, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Google Play, and TuneIn. You also can check out the updates that we posted out on justinbarnes.com. Thanks, everyone. Have a terrific week and stay safe.